there's a lore to it. When George Washington was alive, people didn't think he was perfect. After he died, the story became where he just about was. There's a picture that's painted, I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. There's a very famous painting in Washington, D.C. of showing after George Washington died, and he's like on the clouds, like angelic, because he was so perfect. Think about what were we all taught as a little kid about, and for those young children here, I don't want to burst your bubble, but the idea with George Washington, did he chop down the cherry tree? I cannot tell a lie. That story, they historically know that was not a true story. That was a fable that was told around him because everyone revered George Washington so much that if you're going to teach a kid about not lying, you do it by saying, well, you don't be like George Washington. He didn't tell lies. Don't you do it either. We lift up, we lionize our heroes, our leaders. We make our laws and traditions, we look at them almost as sacred as well. We recognize what this is. And if you don't, it's the U.S. Constitution. It is the document that our government runs off of. When you hear people and professors and all the talking heads on TV talking about the Constitution, they revere it as sacred, practically. And that's the preamble part. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, all of that. And we have all these things that we've put into the Constitution. We have enshrined as literally, the benchmark that we grade by. And it's, you think about it, our Capitol that we have, we have the White House, we have the U.S. Capitol building, the Supreme Court building, and people see them and they ooh and ah as if they are looking at something sacred. And I'm not saying that they're not important, but I'm just saying that we have elevated tradition and our national history to the point where we have looked at it as with reverence, almost as if it was holy. The guys on the Mount Rushmore, none of those guys were perfect. We've had Trump is 47, he was also 45. We've had two guys that have come back twice. He and Grover Cleveland. But we've had 45 individual men who have done so, served as president. None of them were perfect. Doesn't matter if they were presidents that were not looked upon kindly, like Nixon, or presidents that are revered, like Lincoln. People talk of Lincoln like he was a saint, and he. If you study the history closely, none of them were. None of them were sacred or holy. We have forgotten as Americans that, our nation was founded on Christian principles. We are a primarily Christian nation. Not everyone who, Jefferson was not a Christian. Again, bubbles may have burst with that. He was a deist. In other words, he just believed there was something out there. He and Franklin were not what you would call an evangelical Christian. He was not even, they didn't even call themselves basic Christians. They understood Christianity. They just were kind of, they had other things going on. But it's important to know that if our founders heard of how we spoke of them, some of them would be shocked to see how we speak of them with such reverence and such, we can't say anything bad about them. Again, a lot of that happened after they died. Lincoln, again, if you know your history, when Lincoln was president, they hated him in the North. I mean, he obviously wasn't liked in the South either, but that's part of why they left. But In the North, he was drawn as a guerrilla in political cartoons. It was after he died that all of a sudden he was Lincoln. You know, we need to name car companies and towns and everything after him, and he's so wonderful. It was not, you know, there were a lot of things about him that were not perfect. So all that said, we have to understand that our leaders have always been flawed, sinful people. Leaders of every nation are flawed, sinful people. Our Constitution is not perfect. As Christians, we need to remember that. So as we look now at the history in the Bible, we see it's always been like that. We see leaders in the Old Testament that were not perfect. But however, just as we do, with our country, the Jews hold their history very sacred in Israel. And to this day, they still do to some extent. You know, they held very fallible men and women as being, you know, literally almost sacred people. One of the ones that we're going to look at here that we're going to focus on is Solomon. King Solomon, was brilliant. Brilliant. One of the wisest men that have ever been created, and he was given added wisdom by God because he asked him for it. And yet he was far from perfect. So if you look on with me, we are going to look at 1 Kings 4, verse 20, starting with verse 21, and we will read through like 24, I guess, at this point. So 21 to 24. Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For he had dominion over everything west of the river, from Tipshah even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river, and he had peace over all sides around about him. Point number 1. Solomon's renown spread to the extent of the promised land. All right. Solomon, if you don't remember, was David's son. You had King Saul, who was a horrible king. King David, who was a man after God's own heart, wonderful king. Again, with the Bathsheba story, there are things that obviously he was not perfect, and that his son Solomon. And this timeline, some of the dates can be debated by scholars. Solomon was born roughly 991, 992 BC-ish. He becomes king in 970 BC. He built the temple. The first temple that was built was referred to as Solomon's temple because he had it built. Before that, they had a tabernacle that was where the worship was done. But then you notice at the end of Solomon's life, you see a king of Judah and a king of Israel. Solomon was the last king. So even though he was all that, he was amazing, as we're going to remember here by looking at this, he definitely was not perfect. Now, when it says that the first point being on the back of your bulletin on the outline, that his renown spread to the extent of the promised land, this map shows where Israel basically is today. This little part right here. His extent, when it talks about in verse 21, when it says, now Solomon ruled over all the kings from the river, when it says that, is the Euphrates up here. His reign or his influence, because these places up here paid tribute to Solomon. They were economically beholden to him. They were having to pay him for their survival. They were, he was not a warring king. He didn't go to war, but they were paying him great amounts of tribute so that they would be safe. So they ruled all the way, basically his reign ruled from the Euphrates all the way down to the border of Egypt. And they talked about Gaza, where we hear about in the news all the time about Gaza. And think about the Philistines all through the Old Testament, all the problems they had, that was Gaza. Gaza's always been a nightmare for them. He ruled Gaza. He had all these kings. Most of what is today the nation of Jordan, next to Israel, belonged to Israel. Jordan, all the people in Jordan live right in this part of Jordan because it's near the Jordan River with water. That was all Israel. Solomon had the greatest extent of influence of any of the kings in Israel. Israel had always been small. I mean, don't get me wrong. We're not talking it was as large as the Roman Empire or the British Empire. But what they had was the land that God had given to them. Because and I guess I don't remember if I put it in there or not. In Genesis 15, verse 18, was where when Abraham had his covenant made with God, God made that covenant with him where he told him where the promised land would be. And it says, on that day, Yahweh cut a covenant with Abram, saying, to your seed I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. There's the Euphrates. The Kenite, the Kenizzite, and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Gershite, and the Jebusite. Basically everything that was in that description was under Solomon. Pretty close. This is the closest Israel has ever gotten to what God had promised them. And his renown spread far and wide. I mean, it was he had more power than any of the his dad was a warrior king, David was, but his influence didn't spread as far as Solomon's did. His wisdom was known far and wide, as we're about to see. So that's point number one. Point number two, we're going to read verse 25. So Judah and Israel lived in security, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So in other words, from the north, the furthest north that Israel was, which was Dan, the tribes, from Dan to Beersheba, right there. I think I put another set of maps in here. Yeah, this is Israel today. From Dan to Beersheba, right here, this is the area where the tribes were. So everybody was, they had peace. Point number two, Israel lived in peace during the days of Solomon. Solomon's rule brought great security with the neighbors around there. He was a hero in Israel. The people in Israel thought he was a rock star. That's why when you see, in Ecclesiastes, when he's talking, because he's the guy who's the preacher, and he's talking to all these young men who are just thinking he is the best thing since sliced bread. And he's an old man at this point who's gone through he made so many mistakes in his life, and he's talking to them, telling them it's not all, I've had everything. Anything I wanted, I've had, everything is, and he's telling them it's not all it's cracked up to be. But they all thought he was amazing because he was the king, he was this great ruler, he was filthy rich, he was what they wanted to be. And so, I mean, he was literally as close to a rock star hero as you could ever have in biblical times in the Old Testament. And so point number two was that Israel lived in peace. That's all verse 25 is telling you, is they were secure, even from in the tribal area, Dan to Beersheba. Point number three, I will read verse 26, and then it includes 21 and 26. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. Now remember, this is a little bitty country for 40,000 stalls. 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And all these deputies, I'll stop it there for that one. Point number 3, Israel enjoyed great prosperity under the rule of Solomon. If you add up what verses 21 and 22 talked about, with all the tribute that was pouring in verse 21, meaning there was tons of money. I remember my dad, after he started his company, when he retired from the government, and he had a consulting firm, and he would always, one of his famous lines he always said was, "Happiness is a positive cash flow." Well, Israel, if you're looking at 21 and verses 21 and 22, what does that mean? Israel had a major positive cash flow. They had way more money coming in than they had going out. They were getting wealthier by the day. They had prosperity that Israel had never known before. So everything, it seems peaceful. Everything was, there was no want in the country. There weren't people going, "Oh, we have no food," or no. They had more food and more stuff than they needed. And the renown of Solomon and his reputation preceded itself. That's why all these neighboring countries were wanting to. They were paying tribute. They were doing whatever they could to make him happy. Now, verses 27 and 28. And these deputies sustained King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table, each in his month. They left nothing lacking. They also brought barley and straw for the horses, and swift steeds to the place where it should be, each according to the legal judgment for him. Point number 4. Leaders came to eat at Solomon's table. Leaders came to eat at Solomon's table. This is about as close as you can get to the picture we have in modern times with, America at its height and all these, world leaders who want to come and have a state dinner at the White House, and they have get out the best china, and everybody puts on their tuxes and fine dresses, and they have the big to-do. They fire the gun salute for foreign leaders. All the stuff goes with it. All the bells and whistles. All these resources, these huge amounts of resources flow into the kingdom at this time for all the tribute, all of the gifts that are given them by other countries. Solomon invited a variety of leaders to come to his table. And it was, a time of great peace. When you eat with others, you're meeting with them, you're eating at a table. It is and there was an agenda, as you see in those verses, in case you missed that, but it says that each in his month, all the deputies, they rotated. All the deputies from the different provinces of, I think I put a map of provinces on it. Yeah, these are the districts that he divided his kingdom into. That was actually part of what Israel was. And all the governors of all the areas of Israel, they all had commission times. All the leaders that came in, there was a time they had to wait their turn because it was such a busy. They don't have that many state dinners at the White House. They have a few every year. Some presidents have more than others. Solomon, it was a revolving door. And they were coming and bringing gifts to make him happy. And they had this huge feast. But everybody, you couldn't come all the time. You had to wait your turn. You couldn't, because everybody got a turn, schmoozing with King Solomon. So, leaders came to eat at Solomon's table, which, we can look at that and think, okay, that's sort of this is a kind of a preview historically of what it will look like, is it was in peace, everything's going great, everything's happy, as part of the Christian invitation that we have. We're talking about coming to eat at the table of the Lord and the great feast that's in Revelation at the end times and all the things that go with this. And you think that there are other feasts that are mentioned, but this is King Solomon's peace. Part of the peace that he has is coming and bringing everyone together to meet with them and eat with them. So all of this, if you look at this on the surface, it all looks great. He was a fantastic administrator and fantastic king on the surface. Now, keeping all that in mind, I'll read I guess I've already read verse 28. Verses 26 to 28, though, there's something to notice. Despite his wisdom, Solomon ignored many of God's commands. Despite his wisdom, and he had fantastic wisdom, Solomon ignored many of God's commands. These deputies that you see mentioned in here, part of what they were doing, they were sustaining King Solomon and all of the wealth and keeping everything going. Is you have to understand what he's saying here. Where they were being sent to Egypt to get these horses. Israel didn't have that many horses. They were being sent to Egypt to get the horses, which was against what God had told them. And you may think, where did God tell them? I put it in your bulletin, Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. As part of the law, they are told, moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Yahweh has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He had originally told his people after the Exodus, and when they came back and they had received the law, in the law God said, don't go back there for anything. And what Solomon was doing, now this may not seem like that important a thing. Just like in the Garden of Eden, when, you may look and go, well, all they did was eat fruit. They didn't murder anybody. But God had told them not to do it. And then they listened to the serpent tell them that don't listen to God, he's not telling you the truth. And they believed the snake over God. Solomon here is ignoring what looks on the surface as being kind of a minor rule. There's no minor rules in the law. And so when he says, don't go back to Egypt to do this, and he keeps sending people back to get more horses to add to all of his list of goodies that he has, that you're multiplying, you're doing exactly what, and God had known this was going to happen, so he had told them, you can't do that. Now, in 1 Kings 10, 26 to 29, we see Solomon doing this again. Solomon, because he had gotten so big, so wealthy, powerful, and so, and when you're really, really smart, and sometimes when people get really, really smart, they don't see the reason why they can't just cut some corners and do a little, we're gonna, I know God told me that, but he's not gonna care if I do this. He'll start rationalizing. That's what he's doing here. He has gone through and he starts breaking commands that may not seem major, although God, each one of them now is sin, and has rationalized in his mind it's okay. And I included in your bulletin 1 Kings chapter 11. First Kings, if you as a leader, if you as a Christian of any type have, allowed a little bit of sin in the door, Satan's just got his toe in the door. The door, he hadn't pushed the door open, just his toe is in the door, and you let that slide. And then you slowly rationalize, and it's okay, this sin's okay, this sin's okay. Finally, you realize how far away from God you just wandered. and you realize the things that you're now allowing in your life. By 1 Kings 11 and chapters 11 and 12 are full of what is referred to as Solomon's apostasy. In other words, which is flagrant, wild, sinful rebellion against God, even though, he would tell you he wasn't doing anything wrong. 1 Kings 11, verse 1, now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Verse 3, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Away means from God. Now it happened, verse 4, that at that time that Solomon was old. Was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and did not follow Yahweh fully. Then Solomon built a high place, verse 7, for Shamash, the detestable idol of Moab, and on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Moloch was the one that they did child sacrifice to. Verse 8, thus all that he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not walk after other gods, but he did not keep what Yahweh had commanded. Point 5, despite his wisdom, Solomon ignored many of God's commands. When you read most of 1 Kings chapter 4, it's talking about how incredibly successful, again, like all the young guys are listening to Solomon in his old age, talking to them, and they're all thinking, man, if I was just him, if I could live his life, I would be so cool. And Solomon knows at this point in Ecclesiastes that he's made tons of mistakes. And he didn't find happiness chasing after all this stuff. And if you read Ecclesiastes, at the end, he says the secret to life is following God and not getting caught up in all this nonsense. That's a paraphrase, by the way. But it's important to see that Solomon, once you've allowed sin in, what it did to his reign. Eventually, God tells him, I didn't put it in this part, but God says, I'm not going to take the kingdom away from you. This is after this in chapter 11. But I will take it away, I will rip it away from your sons. That's when you've got in that timeline where there's king of Judah, king of Israel. When Solomon dies, the kingdom gets split. Point number 5, verses 29 to 34. And God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of understanding in his heart, like the sand that is on the seashore. You ever seen the sand on the seashore? There's more of it than you can count. That's what he's saying. He had more wisdom than you could even know. And Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and of the wisdom of Egypt. And he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, the Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and the renown of his name was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. You look at the book of Proverbs, there's not that many in there. We don't have all of them. and his songs were 1,005. And he spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. And men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Solomon had been given wisdom that we would look at and think he was like Einstein or Benjamin Franklin, people whose brains could never shut off. He was interested in everything. He was constantly into stuff, doing something with his mind. People came from far and wide to see him. One of the stories that we're not going to look at today, but it's in 1 Kings chapter 10, is the story of the Queen of Sheba traveling. Sheba, by the way, is, right now we have military personnel flying over bombing in Yemen because Yemen is friends with Iran and they're firing missiles at Israel and American warships. Well, but before Yemen was there, way before, there were wealthy kingdoms in this part of Africa, this part of Arabia, and the Queen of Sheba came from the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, went all the way. Remember, we're talking about people from far and wide traveled to Jerusalem because they wanted to hear him talk, be received at his table, bring him goodies as gifts. And chapter 10 of 1 Kings talks about how Queen of Sheba goes up there to see Solomon and talks about how wonderful that she praises how wonderful that King Solomon is. The world was attracted to it. So just picture what we're looking at here compared to modern times and how everyone looks at different countries and how we think, oh, this is so great, because what mankind thinks is important is not what God thinks is important. So what can you take home from this quickly? Conclusion and application on the back of your bulletin. Number 1, gifts from God should be used to bring God glory, not ourselves. Gifts from God should be used to bring God glory, not ourselves. So much, Solomon had asked when he was a young man for wisdom. God gave him wisdom beyond what anyone could imagine, what Solomon could have imagined. And Solomon used much of it for serving the Lord. We have all the book, most of the book of Proverbs are from Solomon, and the book of Ecclesiastes. He wrote all these songs. He was leading God's people during a time of great opulence and peace. But he also used his mind to get himself into trouble other ways. He, to get all this influence, all the peace with all these neighboring countries, all these countries to pay him tribute to, he married all their daughters, the daughters of the kings, and to make peace, which is exactly what God had said to the people. The sons of Israel were not supposed to marry, doesn't matter if you're a king or not, any daughter of those, because, like I've always said, dating gentlemen who are young, even ladies, dating is not an evangelical tool. I've heard people say so many times, well, I'm going to go out with them and I'm going to lead them to Christ. Somebody who's definitely not a Christian. Usually what happens is, that's not what happens. The Christian ends up walking away from most of their faith in trying to make this other person, the non-Christian, happy. Same reason God had told the men of Israel, don't marry the daughters of these foreign lands, because these foreign lands are pagan. They follow pagan gods. You follow them, no matter how strong you think you are, you're going to end up chasing after their gods. And so in 1 Kings 11 into 12, it talks about how these, we read some of it there, that these all these girls that he brought in that were his wives brought with them gods, statues of their pagan gods. And so they started doing pagan worship in Jerusalem. In the temple, there were places where they brought in statues of pagan gods. Why? Because the wives wanted that, and Solomon said, all right. He kept going along with it to the point where it was okay to him. Solomon, not like God ever said that was okay. He never got a waiver from God. So it should be remembered that just because God has given you a gift, you're not supposed to go off and just use it for yourself to get your own gain. God gave you a gift, whether it is wisdom, whether it is a gift of music, the gift of whatever it is that God has given you that is so good. You should be using it to His glory and not yourself. Point number 2, nations and churches who develop tradition end up following that tradition over God. Nations and churches who develop tradition often end up following that tradition over God. So much of what we see in modern Christianity in the 21st century in the United States and Western Europe are religious denominations and churches that have said, well, based on our tradition, we're doing it this. And it's like, okay, show me in the Bible where it says that. Just because you have a book of common practice or something that you've written, that men have written, not God, and you're following that, and you're not following, in fact, you're doing things that are in this little book that are not in the Bible. We cannot say, no matter how wonderful America says that we are, remember, we aren't perfect. That Constitution we looked at before, remember, the Constitution, when it was written, said that African Americans were 3/5 of a person. It said that slavery was legal until 1808 when they would, stop bringing slaves in. There were all these things in there that you could look at and go, what were they thinking? Now, obviously, we had a very broken society that was okay, but that's not a holy document. You can't look at the Constitution and say it's equal to the Bible. No, not even close. It's written by very fallible men, and the Bible is written by a perfect holy God. Point number 3, Jesus is greater than all. If you will look at Matthew chapter 12, which I read from earlier, Matthew 12, when he was talking about he's greater than the temple, when the Pharisees were complaining that the disciples were eating from the grain on the Sabbath, and then look down at Matthew 12:38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered and said to him, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation eagerly awaits for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here, talking about himself. And then, related to our passage this morning, the Queen of the South will rise up with this generation, that's the Queen of Sheba, at the judgment. Remember, at the judgment, that means like at the end, it's like, at the end times. At the judgment, the Queen of the South, Queen of Sheba, will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it, talking about the Pharisees he's looking at right there, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. They rejected Jesus at that time, and yet they would have said Solomon was the best thing in the world. And he's saying, one day at the judgment, the Queen of Sheba is going to be standing there saying, I knew the King Solomon, and I thought he was great. Jesus is the Messiah. They're not the same. Jesus is far greater. This morning, I challenge you to not forget the God of our fathers. Our nation has done so in so many ways. We have followed our own tradition. We have followed what makes us happy, what pleases us, what is convenient for us, and we have stopped following. Most colonists who came over from Europe came originally to find religious freedom because they had been persecuted in Europe. We were founded on Christian principles primarily. We have put aside most of those. And this morning, and this day, with everything you see on the news, we need to not forget the God of our fathers. We need to only worship Him, and we need to pray that our children will know who God is and not whatever our society tries to tell us He is. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you. We thank you for your word. We thank you that you gave us incredible leaders of your people, like King Solomon. And yet, Lord, that no matter how wonderful he looked in person, and no matter how wise he seemed to be to everyone, that we need to understand that you are far greater. That a nation that is built on its own tradition, on its own worship of their own leaders, and lifting up those people as being who they're following. That is not how you ever called it to be. Lord, let us not forget that our nation and so many others were founded under Christian principles, and that we were our Constitution was not written as holy at all, but it was written so that a nation following God could govern itself as best it could. Dear Lord, we ask that we would not turn away from the God of our fathers, that we would turn back toward you and realize that you are far greater than anything that we have found to try to replace you. If there's anyone here who doesn't know you as their Lord and Savior, they have never called on you for forgiveness, but they realize they need to be forgiven for their sin because they are separated from you in their sin. If there's anyone who has done that knows that they need to do that this morning, I pray that they would call on you to save them, to ask for forgiveness of their sin, because what you did on the cross paid for it if they trust in you. And that they would come forward and share that decision with us so that we can celebrate the greatest day of their life. If there's anyone who's done that and they feel that they've wandered off and gotten into stuff they shouldn't have done, allowed sin to creep into their lives, and they feel distant from you, I pray that they'd understand that just as the son of the prodigal son did when he realized how far he thought he was from home, when he turned around to look toward home, he saw Dad running toward him. That if there are any Christians like that in here this morning, I pray they'd understand that if we look toward you, that we'll realize you never left us, and you've been waiting for us to come back to you and to reconcile and to seek forgiveness. And if there's anyone looking for a church home, this is where you led them, called them to be, and that we would welcome them with open arms this morning, and that they would come forward.